The Queen Mother's greatest political weapon wasn't a crown. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even her wartime record. It was her smile. That small, fixed, almost girlish smile made her look harmless for nearly a century. It softened the jewels. It softened the privilege. It softened the spending, the drinking, the class arrogance, the grudges, the staff complaints, the debts, and the old royal cruelty that still lived underneath the pastel hats. The public saw that smile and thought they knew her. The staff saw it disappear when the door closed, and that is where the real Queen Mother begins. London, October 29th, 1940. The Blitz has been running for 52 consecutive nights. Queen Elizabeth moves through a bombed East End street, picks her way through masonry and broken glass, and pauses beside a small boy wearing a steel protective helmet. Photographers are there. The image they capture shows her bent toward him at the waist, composed and warm, that expression fixed, as though she has never had a frightened thought in her life, while the demolished frame of somebody else's home fills the background behind them both. That photograph would circulate for the rest of the century. It did exactly the work it needed to do. 6 weeks before this, German bombs had struck Buckingham Palace itself. The blast took out the chapel, sent glass flying through 3 floors, and left 3 people injured. She wrote to Queen Mary about it with unmistakable shock. "One couldn't imagine that life could become so terrible. We must win in the end." Then added a postscript. "Dear old BP is still standing, and that is the main thing." The horror was present and the steadiness arrived immediately after it. Both were real, and neither canceled the other out. What the photographs showed wasn't a performance. What the photographs also showed was someone who had spent 40 years training herself to keep the horror subordinate to the steadiness. Always in company, always in public, until the two had become functionally inseparable. The PBS documentary on her wartime role describes the mechanism plainly. Her insistence that the royal family remain in London was a reassuring move for the public, and she became a national symbol of the Blitz spirit. That phrase, reassuring move, leaves open whether the decision was strategic or instinctive. In Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's case, that distinction had probably ceased to mean anything by 1940. Her instincts and her strategies had been running on the same track for a long time. Across the Blitz period from September 1940 through May 1941, she and King George VI made repeated visits to bomb districts throughout London and beyond. The Imperial War Museum holds the primary photographic record of these rounds. An Alamy archive photograph documents them leaving a badly damaged home in Hull in 1940. A Reggie Speller photograph from September 11, 1940, shows King George VI alongside Winston Churchill and the Queen, inspecting bomb damage on a street that is no longer quite a street. She is the calmest figure in the frame. The visits were documented, reported, and photographed with enough consistency that they accumulated, over 53 months of war and its aftermath, into something harder to challenge than any single image. A pattern. A woman who stayed. A woman who showed up. A woman whose expression never broke. The visual record extends unbroken across 7 decades of British Pathé newsreels after that. The archive holds footage of her in New York in 1954, receiving an honorary degree at Columbia University, at a reception in Scotland in 1952, in Leeds, and at Lambeth in the mid-50s, at horse races with Queen Elizabeth II in color compilation footage spanning the 1950s and 1960s. The expression does not vary between contexts. It arrives with her, meets strangers and prime ministers and small boys in steel helmets at the same steady temperature. accompanies her through hospital wards and state banquets and evening receptions, where the footage simply notes she is chatting to guests, and then goes home with her at the end. Cecil Beaton arrived at Buckingham Palace in the spring of 1939 for a portrait session that would produce her most lasting iconic images. He photographed her in white tulle and pearls, a tiara arranged before white roses. A visual language so deliberately soft and almost bridal that the approaching war appears to have been excluded from the frame by deliberate agreement between photographer and subject. Beaton was already her devoted admirer and would remain so for the rest of his career. Hugo Vickers, who wrote biographies of both the Queen Mother and Beaton, has described the relationship as one of mutual cultivation. Each gave the other something they needed. She gave him access and a subject worthy of his art. He gave her images worthy of the myth she was building. By July 19, 2000, when she appeared at a pageant at Horse Guards Parade in London for her centenary celebrations, members of the royal family and military personnel arrayed around her, the summer sun on the parade ground. She had been doing this for 77 years of public life. She spoke in what correspondents described as a strong voice. "It has been a great joy," she said. 16 days later, on August 4th, her actual 100th birthday, she received a birthday card from the Queen, as is custom for centenarians. The BBC noted that no other king or queen in British history had lived so long. She had already set the record, at 97 in 1998, as the longest-lived British royal in history. She had first been publicly called the Smiling Duchess in the early 1920s, shortly after her marriage to the Duke of York. 78 years later, the description required no revision. What happens to a public image that survives a century without serious interruption isn't a simple amplification of the original. Something qualitative changes. The person disappears inside the symbol. The smile stops being read as evidence of anything and starts being read as its own kind of proof. Proof that whatever one might have heard to the contrary, the warmth was always real, and the doubters were probably the problem. That transformation is precisely what this story is about. To understand how the smile acquired this national function, you need to understand what Britain needed from her specifically after February 6, 1952, the day King George VI died at Sandringham at 56 years old. George had been, in the public imagination, a controlled sacrifice. The man who stuttered and stayed, whose health declined visibly through the war years, whose face in later photographs carries the particular exhaustion of someone doing something they were never built to carry. His early death, at 56, was laid privately by his widow at his brother's door. But that is getting ahead. The grief at his death was substantial and specific. He had been a wartime fixed point, and losing him was partly losing the wartime era itself, the shared sense of national solidarity and endured hardship that post-war Britain was already beginning to memorialize as its finest hour. His widow stepped into a vacancy the culture had not consciously designed but immediately recognized. Britain in the early 1950s was exhausted. Rationing still in effect, the empire dissolving, the post-war settlement still being negotiated. The new queen was 25 years old. Her mother was the living thread that connected the present monarchy to its recent heroic period. She represented continuity of a kind no one else could quite supply. She was simultaneously extraordinary, queen consort, widow of a wartime king, survivor of the Blitz, and cast in the most available and comprehensible of all roles. She was the national grandmother, someone whose function was to embody the past without demanding anything of the present. Academic analysis of her cultural role has identified this specific resonance. The construction of the aged Queen Mother mapped onto what was expected from any ordinary grandmother. The warmth without the complication, the reassurance without the complexity. This is the sociology underneath the sentiment. She wasn't loved naively. She was loved because she filled a vacancy that post-war British identity had created and couldn't leave empty. The sentiment was genuine. The vacancy was real. The fit between them was too precise to be entirely accidental. The Guardian's 2002 obituary would record plainly that she had always blamed Wallace Simpson for his death, believing that if her husband had not had to be king, he might not have died so young. That blame was private, carried for 50 years, never spoken where cameras could hear. The grief she displayed publicly, at the funeral in February 1952, and across the 5 decades that followed it, was entirely genuine. The private accounting she kept alongside it was equally genuine, and altogether different in character. She was widowed at 51 and remained widowed for 50 years. That duration, displayed without apparent bitterness, maintained with evident grace across thousands of public occasions, was itself a kind of performance. Not because the grief was insincere, but because grief, like warmth, can be real and carefully managed at the same time. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on August 4, 1900, the 9th of 10 children of Lord and Lady Glamis, who would become the 14th Earl and Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her father, Claude Bowes-Lyon, inherited the earldom in 1904. The family maintained 2 addresses, St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire for the London seasons, and Glamis Castle in Angus for Scotland, what the Guardian's obituary described as a privileged Edwardian childhood split between the West End for the London season and Glamis Castle in Scotland. Glamis, during the First World War, was converted into a convalescent hospital for wounded soldiers. Elizabeth turned 14 the week the war began. She spent the next 4 years at the castle and in correspondence with patients who had been treated and discharged. She helped nurse them, entertained them, wrote them letters as they recovered. What this experience provided, among other things, was early instruction in a specific social technology, the ability to make someone in pain or difficulty feel attended to, seen, personally important, without the attending person surrendering any structural authority. Gracious warmth as practical management, care as a form of technique, offered genuinely, producing genuine results, and nevertheless a technique. Upper-class Edwardian women were trained to perform exactly this. The system demanded it. A great house, a London season, a Scottish estate. Each required the simultaneous management of dozens of relationships across several class registers. The operative method was to administer hierarchy so smoothly that no one immediately below you ever felt administered. Graciousness wasn't, in that context, a personality trait. It was an operational requirement. The social distance was structural, invisible, maintained by warmth rather than by coldness, because warmth was harder to resent and harder to name. She absorbed this system so completely that the warmth became her signature rather than her technique. What tends to be underweighted in accounts of her charm is that it wasn't unique to her. She was doing what women of her class, her generation, and her specific training had been prepared to do. She happened to do it at a scale and across a duration that made it look exceptional. The system produced her. She then produced the impression that the system had nothing to do with it. The press bargain she established early gives some measure of how clearly she understood the machinery involved. Shortly after her engagement to the Duke of York was announced in January 1923, she gave one newspaper interview. The palace was displeased. She wrote to her friend and future treasurer, Arthur Penn, around that time. How beastly the papers are. Nothing but lies. She never spoke directly to a journalist again. For the remaining 79 years of her public life, the smile was the only personal information the press would get from her. Everything else was managed from outside, through official channels, authorized biographies, and the access-dependent mutual understanding that shaped the royal-correspondent relationship for the entirety of the 20th century. Now for the perspective that cuts through the official portrait. The people who saw what happened after the smile left her face. On July 7, 1959, the political philosopher Isaiah Berlin sat next to the Queen Mother at a dinner party. He wasn't a naive observer. He had spent his career studying how power works and what lies beneath the social persona. His diary entry from that evening survives and was referenced in subsequent reviews of the Shawcross biography. He found her not indeed particularly intelligent, nor even terribly nice. He noted, however, that she had a very strong personality. The two observations together are more revealing than either separately. The charm was real, but beneath it was force rather than ease. She had taken a private measure of the same gap. In correspondence reviewed by William Shawcross for the official biography, she described herself as not as nice as I seem. Her private vocabulary for managing family conflict, and there was a great deal of it, sustained across decades, included the self-designation, the imperial ostrich. She buried her head. She declined direct confrontation. The resentments calcified privately while the surface remained serene. William Shawcross's official biography was commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II and built on unrestricted access to the Queen Mother's personal papers, letters, and diaries. It runs to 1,096 pages. Its author was conspicuously sympathetic to his subject. The Guardian reviewer assessed Shawcross as probably more Queen Motherly than the Queen Mother, meaning his warmth toward the subject was pronounced even by the standards of authorized royal biography. The Huffington Post was more direct, writing that Shawcross has won the favor of his fellow monarchists by taking the Queen Mother's curdled life and presenting it as the best of British. The official biography was published in 2009, 7 years after her death, a timing that ensured the most significant findings could only be read as historical assessment rather than live criticism. Even this sympathetic account contains admissions that couldn't be omitted entirely. She dominated her family, Shawcross states plainly. He concedes, she may have been a brilliant actress. These lines are in a book that is otherwise unrelentingly favorable. They appear not because Shawcross wanted to undermine his subject, but because the material, the letters, the diaries, the testimony of people who had been in the room, required them. Hugo Vickers's independent biography approaches the same material from a different angle. Vickers had known her personally, one of the very few biographers of any major British royal to have had an actual personal acquaintance with their subject. His account covers what he describes as the problems with Diana, alongside the abdication and the sustained Wallace-Simpson feud. It was Vickers, in his description of her relationship with Group Captain Peter Townsend, the comptroller of her household and Princess Margaret's would-be husband, who chose the word despised. Townsend recorded his own departure from her household in diplomatic language. Both agreed that I should leave the Queen Mother's household. Two accounts of the same event, one from the person who had to leave. The fullest available account of daily life at Clarence House comes from the biography of William Talon, Backstairs Billy, written by Tom Quinn and reviewed by Craig Brown in the Daily Mail in March 2015. Talon joined the royal household at 15 as a Buckingham Palace footman, earning £2 per week. He was exceptionally good-looking, which, according to the testimony of multiple Clarence House colleagues, helped considerably in the palace environment. He learned to anticipate needs, absorbed accents, took on the airs of his betters through what one colleague described as a mimic's genius. He requested a transfer to the Queen Mother's household at Clarence House. She agreed. He remained for 50 years, until her death. Over those decades, Talon became something between a servant and a fixture, an unofficial keeper of the culture of the place. He was, according to Quinn's biography, driven simultaneously by two forces, a powerful sex drive and an intense, almost pathological love for the Queen Mother. The combination produced consequences that Shawcross's official biography handled in approximately one paragraph, noting that Talon was a cultivated but flamboyant man whose off-duty behavior as a boulevardier raised eyebrows, and that when senior household members complained, she would suggest to them that their jobs were under review, while Talon's wasn't. The official biography devotes 3 sentences to the man who spent 50 years at closer quarters to her than almost anyone alive. Quinn's biography devotes considerably more. When the Queen Mother was away from Clarence House, Talon's private pastimes included putting on her hats and tiaras and dancing around the rooms. Photographs of this apparently exist. When she discovered the habit, she did discover it. Her response was delivered without apparent displeasure. "William, I quite understand if you want to wear my hats and other things, but do try to put them back where you found them." His weekly removal of food and drink from the Clarence House larder and wine cellar was known among the other staff as Billy's supermarket sweep. Senior household officials, her private secretary, Sir Alistair Aird, and her treasurer, Sir Ralph Anstruther, found his conduct impossible to manage and brought formal complaints. The complaints produced no result. She preferred the company of someone who made her laugh over the comfort of those tasked with keeping the household orderly, and she had the structural power to express this preference permanently. When Clarence House luncheons ended and guests departed, she would ask Talon what he thought of each person and laugh at his assessments. After one such lunch, she observed, "That really did go rather well, don't you think, William? But perhaps we could have a little more gin next time." Talon, who felt the comment impugned his management of the gin supply, replied, "Perhaps we should have it delivered by tanker." She answered serenely, "I don't think that will be necessary, William." Craig Brown's review includes the story of former Prime Minister James Callaghan at Clarence House. The Queen Mother produced a large box of chocolates and ate steadily throughout their conversation. Occasionally, she pointed Callaghan toward specific ones. He ate them. On his way out, he asked a page why she had directed him only to those particular chocolates. "Those are the ones with hard centers. Her Majesty only eats the chocolates with soft centers." Brown wrote that this single story tells one far more about her character than anything in the 1,096 pages of official biography that William Shawcross dutifully churned out. The observation is unfair to Shawcross, but accurate about the chocolate box. Sir Ralph Anstruther served as her treasurer for close to 40 years and eventually suffered a complete breakdown in health. An accountant named Patrick Kyle, brought in to help manage the finances, grew so exhausted by the effort that his wife repeatedly urged him to retire. Major Colin Burgess served in her household from 1994 through 2002 and later published a memoir, Behind Palace Doors, documenting 8 years of private royal life at close range. A high society diarist told The Sun in 2018 that the Queen Mother had expressed views he considered racist, and which she had made a deliberate decision not to publish, to protect her reputation. He said so directly. The self-censorship was acknowledged. The reasoning wasn't complicated. What all of these accounts share, from Shawcross's careful admissions to Billy Talon's tiaras, isn't hostility toward the Queen Mother. Most of the people involved were genuinely fond of her. The picture they collectively produce is of a woman who was charming in exactly the way a skilled and practiced aristocrat can be charming. Completely, fluently, and with a layer beneath the warmth that served a quite different set of interests. The finances are where warmth and reality can be measured most precisely against each other, because the numbers are specific, and the gap between what the public saw and what the accounts showed is absolute. Her civil list annuity, the public money allocated for her official functions, reached £643,000 per year at its final figure, confirmed in The Guardian's April 2002 reporting. That sum was less than half the cost of employing the more than a dozen full-time staff at Clarence House alone, whose collective wage bill ran to approximately £1.5 million annually. She overspent her official income 8 times over, every year, without interruption, for decades. Queen Elizabeth II reportedly settled the shortfall from private funds. The older retainers, staff who had served her so long they had become a permanent obligation, like the furniture they weren't allowed to replace, were a standing feature of that arrangement. The overdraft at Coutts, the royal bankers, was reported after her death to stand at £4 million. The Queen was reported to have remarked that Coutts would have folded long ago but for Mummy's overdraft. The Queen Mother's own account of the situation, offered to a fellow dinner guest, ran, "Golly, I could do with £100,000, couldn't you? Had such an awful afternoon today with my bank manager, scolding me about my overdraft." Warm, self-deprecating, the specific figure dissolved into the charm of the delivery. She knew the overdraft existed. She treated it as a character detail, rather than a problem. She maintained 4 residences simultaneously. Clarence House in London, staffed by more than a dozen full-time employees. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, her preferred weekend home, described by Shawcross in the official biography as somewhat tired, with unreliable plumbing and central heating, Wellington boots and gardening clothes piled inside the front door. The feeling of old-fashioned country house living. Her daughters occasionally had chairs recovered in identical fabric while she was away, so she wouldn't notice anything had changed. Birkhall, on the Balmoral estate in the Scottish Highlands, was her retreat during the annual royal summer. The Queen gave it a new kitchen for the Queen Mother's 80th birthday, an improvement her mother accepted with the observation that she wouldn't be around much longer, and it wasn't worth it. A line she then repeated at intervals for the next 20 years. Then the Castle of May, the one property she actually owned. She bought it in 1952, in the months immediately after her husband's death, using funds he had left her. Barragill Castle, as it was then called, had been built between 1566 and 1572 in Caithness, on the northernmost mainland coast of Scotland. A semi-derelict pile in Princess Margaret's description, Mummy's draughty castle, requiring electricity and fresh water before it could be occupied. She purchased it for a sum reported variously as approximately £100. She installed electricity, restored the grounds, and renamed it the Castle of May. By 1996, she transferred it to the Castle of May Trust with an endowment attached, after which she paid rent for her annual August visits. The 1,800-acre estate cost at least £500,000 per year to maintain. King Charles still uses it each summer. By 1970, she was running a stable of approximately a dozen racehorses at an estimated cost of more than £1 million per year, alongside an Aberdeen Angus cattle herd at the Castle of May. In the 1960s, Treasury documents later released showed her household had engaged in sustained disputes with Tory government ministers over the payment of expenses for royal haircuts and clothing. The government refused. The rose continued. In 1959, according to her faithful servant Sir Arthur Penn, a financial crisis had brought her close to what he called public humiliation. That crisis resolved. The pattern didn't. In 1994, at 94 years old, she transferred approximately £19 million, two-thirds of her liquid fortune, into a trust fund for her great-grandchildren, including Princes William and Harry. The move was a calculated wager against inheritance tax. The law required the transfer to survive 7 years to exempt it from the 40% levy. She cleared that threshold in 2001. When she died at Royal Lodge on March 30, 2002, her estate included a Monet painting, Study of Rocks, Cruise, Fresseline, bought in 1945 for £2,000 and estimated to be worth up to £15 million. The collection also encompassed a diamond necklace that had belonged to Marie Antoinette, a Fabergé egg collection, works by Augustus John and Graham Sutherland, and assets the Guardian placed at around £50 million in total. The public purse, which had subsidized her lifestyle at £643,000 per year for decades, received nothing from the estate. None of that appeared on the balcony. The drinking wasn't a secret. The management trick was framing it as a personal eccentricity rather than a daily operational reality, and the press accepted this framing willingly. Her routine was documented with enough consistency that it can be stated as settled pattern. Former royal chef Darren McGrady confirmed the noon ritual: gin and Dubonnet, 2 parts Dubonnet to 1 part gin, with a slice of lemon and, as McGrady specified, a lot of ice. Red wine and port followed at lunch. Champagne arrived with dinner. A private note from her to William Tallon, recovered from the Clarence House correspondence, asked him specifically to pack 2 bottles of Dubonnet and gin for a particular journey. The provisioning wasn't improvised. It was a standing domestic logistics problem managed as a matter of daily routine. The press chose a particular way of receiving this information. A Daily Mail piece concluded she wasn't an alcoholic, just a devoted drinker. The phrase attributed to former royal correspondent Charles Ray. Devoted drinker sits in the same register as passionate about horses, a defining personal characteristic, colorful rather than clinical, the sort of detail that makes a public figure feel more human. That framing required a specific selective attention, the charm of the habit, not what it meant to manage it. The Tallon exchange about gin volumes, his proposal of delivery by tanker, her serene deflection, is funny precisely because it discloses the management infrastructure underneath the domestic warmth. Someone at Clarence House was keeping track. Someone was ensuring the Dubonnet was stocked, the gin was ready, the ice was there. The private household that emerges across the staff accounts was organized around her preferences, with the attentive detail that only very powerful people receive, and very few people acknowledge receiving. The public, encountering the gin and Dubonnet stories as charming gossip, didn't need to engage with this infrastructure. The smile translated the information, warmth framed as eccentricity, eccentricity framed as lovable national character framed as something belonging to everyone, rather than something that cost £643,000 a year, and then some. If the drinking illustrated the gap between public framing and private reality, the grudges demonstrated something harder, that warmth and resentment can coexist without either diminishing the other. For 50 years. December 11th, 1936. King Edward VIII signs the instrument of abdication, and her husband, a man with a pronounced stammer, deteriorating health, and no appetite for sovereignty, becomes King George VI. She had been watching the situation develop for years before it resolved itself. In a letter to Queen Mary dated August 1, 1933, she described conditions around Edward and Wallis Simpson. Relations are already a bit difficult when naughty ladies are brought in. That is 3 years before the abdication, and she was already documenting it. By 1939, the language had abandoned its restraint. Writing to Prince Paul of Yugoslavia, with war underway and the Duke of Windsor in France reportedly considering a return to Britain, she stated her position on Wallis Simpson. "The mass of the people don't forgive quickly, the sort of thing that he did to this country, and they hate her." The capitals are in the original. She wrote them herself. In her own hand, in a separate document, "Mrs. Simpson isn't fit to be queen." She called Wallis "that woman" in private conversation, a form of address that strips the other person of name, of individual identity, reducing them to category. Wallis, for her part, called the Queen Mother Cookie, reportedly a reference to a resemblance she claimed to see with a fat Scottish cook. Edward extended the nicknames. Princess Elizabeth became Shirley Temple. The private cruelties ran in both directions. What distinguished the Queen Mother's version was that it was backed by institutional power and sustained without interruption for 5 decades. Michael Thornton documented the result: 50 years of steely and implacable ostracism. She supported the decision not to grant Wallis the title Her Royal Highness after the 1937 marriage. The exclusion held for the duration of the Windsors' lives. Edward died in May 1972. Wallis Simpson died in April 1986. She outlived them both, and the ostracism outlived them with her. The Guardian's 2002 obituary stated plainly, Elizabeth always blamed Wallis Simpson for his death, believing that if her husband had not had to be king, he might not have died so young. That view was never expressed publicly. It was carried privately, sustained alongside a public image of serene widowhood for 50 years. The smile continued to function throughout. The Townsend situation followed the same structural logic. He eventually left her household. Vickers chose the word despised for her feelings about the situation. The method was the imperial ostrich. She declined direct confrontation, waited for the pressure to resolve itself in the direction she preferred, and wasn't at Clarence House on the night it did. On the night of Princess Margaret's final meeting with Townsend, the night on which any genuine hope for the relationship ended, the Queen Mother had an evening engagement at the University of London. Margaret had dinner alone on a tray.
The relationship with Diana, Princess of Wales, is harder to document with comparable specificity, and the available evidence does not support the confident account the tabloids later constructed. What is established is that she was instrumental in facilitating the match between Charles and Diana Spencer, whose grandmother, Lady Ruth Fermoy, was a close friend and lady-in-waiting. What followed is contested in the sources. In 1993, Princess Margaret destroyed several black bags of correspondence that Diana had written to the Queen Mother, apparently judging the letters too personal to survive. Whether this was protective or something else remains an open question. The biographers note the Diana chapter in Hugo Vickers' account without reproducing its specifics in reviewable form. The imperial ostrich had long since established that some things were best left unaddressed in writing. The press bargain that kept the private reality invisible for most of her life wasn't formally coordinated. It didn't need to be. The structure produced the behavior without requiring explicit instruction. After the palace's displeasure over her single post-engagement interview in January 1923, she never spoke to a journalist in a direct interview again. Every item of information the press received came through official channels, authorized biographies, or the carefully managed proximity that defined the royal correspondent relationship throughout the 20th century. Royal correspondents operated, and still operate, within a system in which access depends on maintaining working relations with the palace press office. Self-censorship in that environment isn't coercion. It's the rational adaptation of a professional who understands how the access will be withdrawn. The wartime period had established a stronger precedent. The monarchy stood above criticism when national morale was at stake, and that precedent proved far easier to sustain than to dismantle once the war ended. The institutions, the habits, and the mutual understandings between the palace and the establishment press were already in place. Applying them to a beloved, elderly, non-controversial widow cost the press corps nothing and preserved a working relationship worth preserving. The diarist who told The Sun in 2018 that he had refused to publish the Queen Mother's racist views in order to protect her was making the suppression explicit and voluntary. He acknowledged the decision. He considered it a reasonable one. The mechanism wasn't malice. It was the same professional instinct that had been operating throughout her public life. The evidence existed, the decision was made not to use it, and the smile continued. When she died on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, the BBC devoted 10 days to royal coverage. Broadcasting watchdogs received complaints that the coverage was insufficiently critical and rejected those complaints. Thousands queued for hours at Westminster Hall. The media handled the death in exactly the way the relationship between the press and the palace had been designed to produce. Reverentially, collectively, with any dissenting analysis carefully marginalized as poor taste. There were feminist voices at the edge of the mourning. They were largely ignored. She was 100 years old when the public seemed to decide, collectively, that she had become something other than a person. A monument. A proof of something about Britain that couldn't easily be named, but was felt with remarkable intensity. In 1998, at 97, she had set the record as the longest-lived British royal in history. By her 100th birthday, the BBC was noting that no monarch in British history had lived so long. Longevity does something specific to a public image. It removes the frame of contemporaneous scrutiny, the people who might have offered a different account, who remembered the same events from different positions, who had carried their own version of the same years, died before her, or lost the cultural authority to be heard. Edward VIII died in 1972. Wallace Simpson died in 1986. Peter Townsend outlived her, but never wrote from a position of institutional power. She absorbed the deaths of her critics and continued. Critical biography arrived only after she was gone. Vickers' independent account appeared in 2005. Shawcross's official biography followed in 2009, 7 years after her death. The first official royal biography in nearly 20 years, built on unrestricted access to her personal papers, and yet published at a point when the subject couldn't be confronted with its findings, and when the culture had already calcified around the image. The Guardian's Tanya Gold reviewed the Shawcross volume as a moment of raising the dead queen, a process that involved handling the most uncomfortable material with the soft focus of retrospective official sympathy. The centenary celebrations of July 2000 functioned as formal canonization in advance of death. The Horse Guards Parade pageant was a state occasion organized around her alone. Parliament declined to declare a national holiday, but the event was nationally significant in all but name. She had been old for so long that she had become ancient, and being ancient in British public life is a form of untouchability. No one mounts a forensic critique of a monument. The smile had been standing long enough that the building behind it had been forgotten. She had also made a significant structural contribution to this outcome through her absolute control of her own image across 8 decades. She gave one newspaper interview in her life,
and was so sharply corrected that she never gave another. She became, with age, increasingly reluctant to commit private views to paper at all. Shawcross records her growing caution about leaks, keeping even correspondence more guarded than it had been in her earlier decades. The letters she did write illuminate, as Shawcross noted in his preface, sides of her character which weren't always clear to people beyond her immediate family. The public received the edited version. The smile, the strong voice at Horse Guards Parade, the "It has been a great joy." Her last known letter, written in August 2001, was a thank you to Prince Charles for the birthday gift of a bath towel. She died the following March. Whatever the last months contained, the hip replacements, the severe cough contracted at Christmas 2001, the death of Princess Margaret 7 weeks before her own, none of it disturbed the public image. She was old and brave and gracious to the end. The story wasn't false. It was incomplete in ways that mattered. Here is what was true. She was a genuinely warm woman who could also be hard, cold, and unforgiving. She maintained genuine affection for people she also used. She felt real love for a husband whose early death she privately laid at his brother's door for the rest of her life, carrying that accounting for 50 years, while her face showed only the grief and never the blame. She was generous in ways that cost her nothing, and in ways that cost her enormous effort. She ran up a £4 million overdraft while keeping the Monet. She drank 2 parts Dubonnet to 1 part gin at noon every day and called it a daily routine. She wore the warmth as an Edwardian aristocrat wears courtesy, constantly, fluently, as a management instrument, and with enough genuine feeling underneath it that the instrument and the feeling became impossible to separate, perhaps even for her. Isaiah Berlin came away from the July 1959 dinner party with the note that she was not indeed particularly intelligent, nor even terribly nice. She came away from decades of such evenings with the unshakable public reputation of the most lovable woman in Britain. The difference between those 2 assessments is the smile, and what it did. The smile worked because Britain wanted it to work. It allowed the country to see a grandmother where there was also a creditor, a drinker, a grudge holder, a demanding employer, and a woman trained by one of the hardest class systems in Europe to present exactly the face that was most useful at any given moment. The public saw the balcony appearances, the bombed East End streets, the centenary pageant at Horse Guards, the pastel hats, the bent posture over the small boy in the steel helmet. The people who served her, the ones who counted the gin and managed the overdraft and absorbed the despised categorization, and had chairs recovered in matching fabric while she was away, were behind the curtain, holding the coat, carrying the glass, waiting for the mood to change. The public saw the smile. The staff saw what happened after it left her face. That isn't a contradiction. That is how the most effective kind of performance works. Real enough to believe, warm enough to protect against scrutiny, and deployed across a century with enough consistency that the belief became the truth, and the truth could safely be left unexamined. Subscribe for more stories like this.